Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 801, April the 13th, 1987. I have two quick announcements before I proceed with the more formal part of the broadcast. Starting May the 4th, that's 2 Mondays from now, World Watchers will begin at 7 o'clock instead of 8. 7 to 9 instead of 8 to 10. The more formal part of the program, the news, will be for 1 hour, 7 to 8. The talk show part from 8 to 9. So make a note on your calendar so you don't miss that first hour of World Watchers. I don't want you to miss a single minute of it. March the 25th on Saturday, this is a week from Saturday, there will be various demonstrations and people protesting certain activities of our government, a lot of them particular activities. And this meeting has taken place in the last few years in San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, and Washington. The Peace March group are going to assemble here in Monterey County. If you want to go, I'll give you the phone number, 372-8887, Nuclear Freeze Group. The bus fare is $20. It leaves at 8 in the morning on Saturday. It returns at 7 p.m. at night. I went up there last year. I'm going to do it again this year. Meet at the Greyhound bus station in Monterey. And if you want to go up for the day and be back by 7 in the evening, you can call the Nuclear Freeze Group in the Monterey Peninsula. For those of you who hear World Watchers up in the Bay Area, in Los Gatos, Los Altos, Cupertino, San Francisco, and so forth, many of you do go to this Peace March, and I do too, and hopefully we can find some place to meet in common and get together for a few hours a week from Saturday. On November 24th, 1986, I did a broadcast, and not enough of it. I was going to continue, and then the news went on so quickly. It was about how the election was stolen in 1980 by Ronald Reagan, and the maneuvers called the October 22nd movement, with the intent of keeping the hostages in Iran and sabotaging the rescue mission, which now we learned was arranged by General Secord and Oliver North and the people inside the White House National Security Council. And I was talking about the stealing of the election and the links of these contragators to getting Ronald Reagan in office in the first place in 1980. A very good article on that subject was written by Fred Landis for Covert Action, April 1981, on the stealing of the election, and Don Freed did an article for the first issue of Rebel, the one that I have the cover story, the Nazi connections to the Kennedy assassination. And of course these people tap right into that. They're not separate from it, but I've made those connections other times and will be doing in the future. Just this past week, as a matter of fact yesterday, the night news service had in the San Jose Mercury and in the Miami Herald, and part was in the LA Times, the story that Iranians are talking about the fact that Ronald Reagan and his team coerced them to hold off the hostages. Of course, they wanted to do that anyway because they didn't want Jimmy Carter elected. And Reagan was making preparations to rearm Iran in exchange for holding up the release of the hostages until he was elected president. Now, that national stealing of the election is a scandal just breaking in the news services, and I'm sure that the Iran-Contra investigations are going to have to tap into that. The group of people described by Fred Landis in his October 22nd movement article include Center for Strategic International Studies and the Heritage Foundation. In the last 2 weeks, I've been talking about accuracy in media, and Reed Irvine and 4 members of the board of Heritage Foundation are also on the board of accuracy in media. Oh, pardon me. Just hit the mic a little bit. Hope it's okay for you. Midge Decter is one of them. Honorable Shelby Cullum Davis is another. Honorable Claire Booth Luce is one. And Honorable William Simon. And also a large funder of AIM is Richard Mellon Scaife, who puts up the money or a big hunk of it for the Heritage Foundation. So the very people that were sabotaging the election by making sure that the hostages were tied up in Iran until Reagan was elected, a large section of these people are also, as I say, with Reed Irvine on accuracy in media, and I'll be doing more of that in a few moments. I've been running down for the past few weeks various very important fascists that are being rounded up, jailed, charged with crimes. I reviewed them for you last week, and I left off still another one. I mentioned Reverend Potter Gale, Juan Lopez Rega, Franklin Camper, Francesco Pazienza, Stefano Delle Chiaie, Carlos Lederrivas, and I forgot to say that Paul Marcinkus and two bankers from the Vatican Bank are wanted by the Italian authorities for promissory notes that were missing due to the Vatican's connection to Banco Ambrosiano. $1.2 billion were put in 10 dummy fronts in Panama. So Paul Marcinkus is wanted by the authorities in Italy as well as two members of the Vatican Bank. So that makes 7 major operations that connect to the P2, to the Aryan nations, to the White House Contragate team. Again, Francesco Pazienza, Michael Ledeen, and their connections to Licio Gelli. I won't run those down for you, but there's an interlocking link, interestingly enough, between these 7 people who've been locked up, arrested, or wanted for arrest, such as Paul Marcinkus in the Vatican. The Washington Post had a story this morning that the White House widens its Iran investigation, that they're taking seriously the special prosecutors that are getting ready to call 191 witnesses, if you would believe it. They've listed 191 witnesses or organizations. Well, you can imagine if an organization is included there, try the P2, try the Nugan Bank. How about the connections to Stanford Technology? And then you open a real ball of wax. But the important thing is that the investigation is going to proceed and that the powers that be have broadened their search, and the attorney for the President of the United States is broadening the material that he wants, I suppose, to defend the President of the United States. And interestingly enough, the Washington Post story today said that they want papers going back to the day that Ronald Reagan was elected president. Not 1985, 86, when the money went to Iran, where the weapons went to Iran, the money went to the Contras, when Congress said it couldn't be sent to the Contras for military purposes. The investigation, as of this moment, goes back to the start of Reagan's first term, according to the administration officials and documents. Now, if they would just go back to his first term as governor, they'd really be hitting some hard bases and go for Helene von Damm and Stanford Technology and Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins and Albert Hakim out of TCI that became IIS, and Hakim took it over. The good way for them to understand the whole process, which of course they're not going to do, but I'm very surprised today to see that the investigation is going to the day Reagan was sworn in as president. And of course, I mentioned before on World Watchers that the very first National Security Council meeting was about Iran, and it was about Libya. This is very important. The policies that he was to pursue for 6 years after the United States arms those countries, then the United States has an excuse with Israel to go to war against those countries, and the Defense Department, CIA, and National Security Council were very much a part of arming them in the first place. I mentioned last week on World Watchers that the United Nations files on Nazis are to remain closed. If I repeat something on this program, I do it for a specific purpose, and I'm aware that I do it, and I try to give you new information every week. But I promise you I will probably read this one article every week when World Watchers begins. And the one I'm citing now is from the New York Times, March 26, 1987. UN files on Nazis to remain closed. Former members of the United Nations War Crimes Commissions have rejected the Israeli request that the commission files on Nazi war criminals be open. The spokesman said that 16 of 17 nations that were members of the commission told the Secretary General, Xavier Swelar, that they opposed the Israeli request. The United States was among those opposing the request. Now, why is it important that we find out who the people were whose names are on this list? 36,810 files. Now, we know one was Joseph Mengele. He was pretty important. The other was Adolf Eichmann. We know he was pretty important. And 2 or 3 names have been revealed. But who are the 36,806 other people? 3 were mentioned. And I want to know about Fritz Kramer and Otto von Bolschwing. And the reason it's important, if I just run down for you 18 reasons right now, I think you'll get the idea. I'm going to cite 18 articles that have been in the news just the past week or week and a half to show you where we're going, because the real goal of these people was to wage a war against Russia. And this time, we are not going to only pay with our taxes and our debts, but with our lives. I want to quickly run down the kind of thing I'm reading in my newspapers every day ad nauseum, and it's terrible. One's from the New York Times, March 23rd, 1987. It talks about Secretary of the Navy John Lehman, who's ready to retire, and how Lehman has set up his plan to attack the Soviet Navy in the Arctic Ocean. I told you I heard him on Nightline 2 years ago telling how he would start World War III in the Arctic Ocean, detailing it on their program. But now it's printed up in the New York Times, and there an article by Bernard Trainer, and then in large letters it says some civilians are skeptical of the concept. They consider it suicidal. So if you are suicidal and don't know who those 36,000 other people are, or more than that, just keep the list locked up and let them proceed with what they want. Another article, April the 10th, 1987, John Lehman ends his tour of duty, full speed ahead. They gave him a 19-gun salute when he left the Navy. And Lehman, early in his career, according to this article, switched control of the Center for Naval Analysis from the University of Rochester to the Hudson Institute in 1983 because he couldn't stand somebody getting Navy money and giving him answers he disagreed with. Now, Marge Decter, on the board of Accuracy in Media, on the board of the Heritage Foundation, the mother-in-law of Elliot Abrams, sending money from various countries to fight the people in Nicaragua. She is one of the board members and officials of the foundation, and I could give you more, but the Hudson Institute is a close affiliate of Marge Decter and Elliot Abrams family. San Francisco Examiner, January 31st, several months ago, expert says Star Wars could turn sniper. Like an orbital sniper, Reagan's proposed Star Wars system could use a laser beam to kill enemy leaders from space, a Bay Area arms expert and scientist said Friday. They talked about the ghoulish use of Star Wars, particularly destroying by a laser beam from outer space a whole city or an individual person. Assassinations and destructions of cities are a far cry from the stated goal of SDI, but they could involve the use of lasers, particle beam weapons, and other gadgetry to provide a defense shield from attack missiles, but it also could be used for severe burns, burning towns, and as an example of a joke, the scientist for SDI said, it might be used to assassinate members of the Soviet Politburo attending the annual parade at Red Square. Now, that was the exact stated goal of Project Paperclip when known Nazi war criminals were brought to this country, and this is what they want to use. They stated it in 1945, and here it is in 1987 as part of the Star Wars project. San Francisco Chronicle, February 2nd, 1987, United States defense work going overseas. $9 billion in military contracts go to foreign companies. The $156 million to Rolls-Royce in Britain, $102 million to a company in Italy, more to a bomb factory in France. We're contracting our weapons overseas to be made in other countries, which might leave us a little vulnerable in case they can't get them to us on time. And also it's an employment problem here if people want to manufacture them, and I think they should be diverting from that. Another article, February the 8th, 1987, Israel prepares for possible chemical weapons, and this has to do with Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin saying that they are passing out or thinking about gas masks in Israel, and the Civil Defense Program, while it was shelved for a while, may be brought back because millions of gas masks and other equipment stored underground will be used in case of a Syrian attack. I think having the neutron bomb with Israel, the capability, could be just as well involved in the chemical, biological neutron bomb attack, but they use the excuse of defense, like Ronald Reagan uses the defense, Star Wars, SDI, when we know it could be a first strike attack, so Israel is getting their millions of gas masks ready. Militarizing space, an article April the 8th, 1987, behind the immediate cause of the latest failure of policies in regarding the missiles and the rockets is that Reagan has been a virtual prisoner of the military-industrial complex, and his whole interest is paring down the expenses needed to take care of the exploratory use of space as they get ready for Star Wars. And of course, I've cited this article before. It came out February 22nd, 1987. Preparing for World War IV, under the cloak of black budget secrecy, the U.S. is spending billions on nuclear bombers, millions to train dolphins as underwater saboteurs. 2 years ago, the president asked for and got what was codenamed the Aurora Project. The project soared from $80 million in 1986. They now want $2.3 billion in 1987, and nobody knows what the Aurora Project is. This is $35 billion for long months of nuclear war of World War III, and then the preparation of World War IV with robots stalking radioactive battlegrounds, satellites orchestrating nuclear attacks, generals speeding along interstates in lead-lined trucks. Washington Post, March 21st, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, wants $20 million for fallout shelters. Those fallout shelters, the $20 million, are for 600 bomb shelters to be built for local officials in Washington. The project will cost $1.5 billion between 1988 and 1992, but they want $20 million to start the project and get ready to protect 600 specific shelters. Another article in the Science News, 1987, volume 131, Biological Warfare Research Under Fire. The government is escalating, as you know, the biological weapons. And an agreement came between the Biological Warfare Symposium scientists at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and they discussed the Army's Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease at Fort Detrick, which again they refer as defensive biological weapons. The Department of Defense uses nearly 20 government labs, more than 100 universities, and private groups such as Stanford University have $87 million right now into genetic weapons or genetic systems that could be biological warfare. So they're moving along with a great amount of funds for that. New York Times, March 21st, 1987, March 22nd rather, new exercises set for Honduras, preparing 50,000 troops for Latin exercises that'll take place May 1987. Large warships from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, amphibious brigade of 5,000 Marines. And then another article along the same lines from the New York Times, U.S. plans to rehearse the war with Nicaragua. The code name is Solid Shield. The New York Times, Washington Post, March 22nd, Air Force plans to hide secret fighter. The stealth fighter requires billions of dollars, and this article says that they want to house and put weapons on the stealth bombers, and that would come to over $1 billion just to build places to put them, $1 billion for arming them and sheltering them. That has nothing to do with the multi-billions that go into the stealth, but they want to spend another $1 billion just to put them somewhere after they're made, put them away. March 29th, 1987, Washington Post, Navy petitions U.S. legislatures to approve aircraft carriers. Secretary Navy John Lehman, as he leaves the department as Secretary of Navy, is asking, please, to let them have 2 more ships for $7 billion, $3.5 billion each. And he promised and did a breakdown that 44 of the 50 states would get some kind of business out of this if we would just let them have the money, $7 billion for 2 more ships. The states that were not included in getting gravy from these contracts are Alaska, Arkansas, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming, and all the other states would get all this loot and all this cash jingling if they would allow $7 billion for 2 ships. March the 11th, 1987, at Oakland Tribune, Caspar Weinberger calls for missile defense prepared for space flight. And he's saying that we have to be ready for combat beyond the Earth's atmosphere, that we have to use the civilian commercial boosters that are launching military payloads in an emergency. And he signed a directive February the 4th, just several weeks ago. And then he immediately classified it secret, and the censored version of the document tells how the Pentagon announced their wishes to turn the space programs that are civilian into war, be prepared for a fight in space. Previous internal directives on the subject have discussed the need for military to ensure U.S. access to space, to the satellites, communications, navigation, and so forth. Be prepared that it will be transferred for our fight. Another article, April the 2nd, 1987, NATO generals plot suppression. The NATO generals, the title looks confusing, but the article says the latest war games cooked up by NATO military chiefs go further than ever down the road to nuclear annihilation. They had a testing from March 3rd to 17th in Europe, involved over 500,000 troops from NATO, and they played war games involving Navy and various governments and departments of governments, and there were two aspects of Wintex, it was called, WINTEX, those games that were disturbing to peace movements. One is the way in which World War III was mapped out. The Soviet Union would create tension in the Middle East and Central America. This would divert attention while preparations were made for attack on Europe. NATO would not renounce their concept of a nuclear first strike in strategy, and the NATO chiefs have deliberately set up war games built around the concept of first strike and are drumming it into military, government, and civil service personnel in Western Europe. And this is stirring up a lot of anxiety about reducing weapons there, because the Wintex project of 87 has to do with operating in Afghanistan, rehearsal landings in Scandinavia countries, and specializing in materials all over Western Europe and Britain in preparation for World War III. April the 4th, 1987, from the People's Daily World, portable death. Can you see a sign of relief? The Air Force plans to get $20 billion to guarantee a constant source of electrical power in case of protracted nuclear war. The plan calls for the deployment of 300 small nuclear reactors to be transported by air around the country and overseas. When the nuclear war comes, we don't want to lose our power system. There will be airborne reactors. Westinghouse will get the contract, and they will follow around where the MX, the Trident missiles are, the stealth bombers, and while those are being made, we will have our own energy, our own source of energy, and this will be contracted, as I say, to Westinghouse. That will be $20 billion. Are you adding up the billions? And then March 24th, 1987, New York Times, experts testify again and again, U.S. is not ready for a war. They're not ready yet. Ronald Reagan has spent $1.5 trillion in weapons in the past 6 years, but we're still not ready for a war. And the idea is, where should the money go? Should it be put into the troops or into the missiles, high-cost weapons, or should the money be diverted to the Pacific region? And various people testified that there would be a casualty nightmare and a medical nightmare. So many would be killed, and we're not ready yet, that we should put more into the troops, because officially what this article in the New York Times is saying, we're not ready, and John Lehman is announcing when he will strike, and as an advisor on the outside, he can have more influence even than a Secretary of the Navy. He can help create the incidences which cause the war or lobby for weapons that will be used in the war. And then, of course, there was another long article besides the one on World War III and IV, and many of you saw that one, $35 billion for secret projects, vanishes from public sight. This is a series done by the Philadelphia Inquirer on the black budget and the mysterious weapons that are kept secret. The military share alone has grown eightfold to $17 billion of the budget. The secret budget has grown eightfold, and it is a huge amount of money never accounted for, and they're making all kinds of weapons and planning the kind of attacks such as the Manhattan Project was with the atomic bomb during World War II, except there seems to be unlimited money. The Black Project doesn't worry about money. This article says people that work at the Lockheed Missile Space Company in Sunnyvale said, if you need the money, you've got it. You've got all you want. So those are about 17 reasons why it's important to investigate, why I think it's important to investigate that list of 36,000 Nazi war criminals to see where they are in terms of defense industry, in terms of engineers, in terms of location with missiles and rockets, with hospitals, mental hospitals, schools where they're making these horrendous bombs and genetic alteration weapons for World War III and plans for World War IV. This involves a lot of people from Poland, Germany, Eastern Europe, who were on the side of Adolf Hitler, who were brought to this country, whose sole goal is to return the monarchy and the powers that be and wipe out the Soviet Union at any cost, and they'll build their own housing and shelters and their own portable energy, and all of it is going to war. Now, I want to just bring up one other subject that is consistent with the psychology of war, and these are the individual deaths, not the accumulated mass deaths of war. Many of you might have seen the articles that came out this past week. One is titled, Fifth British Scientist Dies Mysteriously. Another one from the LA Times, British Scientist Death, Suicide or Conspiracy. Imagine the word conspiracy, using conspiracy, when 5 to 6 people have died or disappeared under the most horrendous circumstances, and many of them work for the same company. I'm not going into the details of their death, but it reminds me of the book Alternative 3 by Leslie Watkins, and all of a sudden the accumulated death of people around a certain group is being considered as a possible conspiracy. I haven't seen that word in the establishment press in the United States. Really, I mean, this is quite a milestone. Conspiracy, written by Tyler Marshall of the LA Times. LA Times also had an article this week by Michael Wines and Ronald Ostro titled, Deaths of U.S. Agents Tied to Embassy Leaks. 6 Soviet citizens said executed since 1985 that are linked to our embassy, and that there's a growing alarm over the losses. It seems to appear that lights are going out in a certain way, that certain agents have been recruited in the embassy, and then they have died. Imagine thinking that these serial deaths have a connection. Again, you can keep reading these articles and we'll go over them, but this is quite a change of thinking. Now let's run to the Contragate deaths, and I don't want to do a whole evening of that. I want to do some more on accuracy in media. And I am collecting a whole series of them. It'll be more than just one broadcast. I mentioned Stephen Carr, who died in March of 85, and Adler Barry Seal, February the 20th, 1986. Key people with the Christic Institute suit, with the connection of narcotics traffic, intelligence community, National Security Council, and the Contra operations. David Aronow in Miami, February 1987, and Franz Pastella, another boat builder, boat enthusiast in Miami, just days apart, 9 days later in Miami, ? Pietro Alfano, a defendant in the New York pizza trial, was shot and survived February the 14th, 1987, and he, of course, links to the cocaine of Colombia, to these same cast of characters, the Contra characters and deposits in the Merrill Lynch and the E.F. Hutton brokerage houses very close to the White House. Those deaths I've cited before quickly, and someday I'll do the details again on them. And Cyrus Hashimi, was killed in July 86 in London. George Perry, linked to the arms to Iran, was murdered in 1983. But then the most important connection to these people is not, these are what I call the arrangers that are being killed that have some part in the action. But the top dogs are dying so quickly and in such a cluster that we have to take a look at them just like they're looking at the people in the Soviet Union that are dying associated with our agency, or the scientists in London, 6 of them now. And I've mentioned Santos Trafficante, his importance to the whole history of our time since the Bay of Pigs, and certainly before. Edward Lansdale, Trafficante, died in April, on April 19th, 1987, all linked with the CIA, Defense Department, and with the Contras. Edward Lansdale, February the 24th, 87. Michael Burke, whose biography I haven't really detailed with you for a long time, he died February the 13th, 1987, close to Michele Sindona, Gulf and Western, Madison Square Garden, and the Reagan entourage in Hollywood. And Burke's attorney at Gulf at Western is the law office of Simon Rifkin and Arthur Lyman. Lyman's now chief counsel for Senator Inouye's investigation of Contra-Iran affairs. And, of course, William Casey, for all purposes, is brain dead. But the 5th person of this entourage, of this planner group that connects, going back certainly to the murder of John Kennedy, if not before, is Clint Murchison, Jr., who died April the 1st, just a week ago. He was part and parcel of the Minutemen group. He was the founder of the Dallas Cowboys. He turned it over, or sold it to Bum Bright, Bright is one of the 3 people at John Birch Society who used the name of Bernard Weissman on that ad, wanted for treason the day Kennedy was killed, worked with a bunch of Nazis and used the name of the Jew. I want to do more on Murchison before I get to accuracy in media, and of course he connects up to those people, but I'll take a 1-minute break now because Murchison, Clint Murchison Jr. is very, very important, and it's interesting that he dies. I know he's had this long, lingering disease. I don't think he was murdered. He's had a long disease, but in a 2-week time, Trafficante, Lansdale, Burke, Casey, and Murchison out of commission when these really were the top dogs. So after this 1 minute, I'll continue more on Murchison and then do part 4 of Accuracy in Media. This is Mae Brussell, and this is the second half of World Watchers, program number 801. When I refer to William Casey as being dead, ever since he had those nervous twitches inside the CIA building about 24 hours before he was to testify regarding the Iran-Contra affair, he was taken to a hospital, brain surgery was done, and nobody has seen a picture of him or a picture at the bedside of William Casey since. He's being fed through some place in his head, and for all purposes, he's just about as dead as Mr. Santos Trafficante, or Edward Lansdale, or Mike Burke, or Clint Murchison. He's in that category, and it's just a matter of hours or days or weeks, but he hasn't functioned since that time when they took him away in the ambulance. Regarding the Clint Murchison Jr., the article describing his death, the obituary in the New York Times, they described him as the son of one of Texas's famed wildcat oil families who created the Dallas Cowboys. He had been sick with a neurological disorder. His fortune at one time was $250 million. He's been under bankruptcy proceedings. His home was for sale, and he created a team, which, as I say, he sold to Bright, a member of the John Birch Society, a close friend of Murchison's. He sold it for $60 million, the Dallas Cowboy. So he was a Phi Beta Kappa from Duke University, was in the Marines. He studied math, got a master's degree at MIT, and he also was a very conservative wheeler and dealer. Penn Jones Jr. wrote in his book, one of the 4 books, Forgive My Grief, that the evening before John Kennedy was murdered, there was a meeting at the home of Clint Murchison where the decision was made, the final decision, that to go ahead and kill John Kennedy the next morning. Richard Nixon was in town at that home. J. Edgar Hoover was there, and Murchison was a close friend of J. Edgar Hoover, and he had 4 very important links to what the things that are affecting America today. He provided funds for George Lincoln Rockwell, a head leader of the American Nazi Party, which was later turned over to William Pierce, a former contractor to the Air Force and professor from Oregon, who runs the Nazi Party now. Lee Harvey Oswald had the telephone number of George Lincoln Rockwell in his address book, and Murchison was a huge funder of Rockwell. He also helped Robert Depew of the Minutemen. He helped fund the Minutemen, and they've been involved in various documents, government documents, archives regarding the murder of John Kennedy. He also was close to Carl McIntyre. This Carl McIntyre was the head of the National Council of Christian Churches, and McIntyre's close contacts were with Albert Osborne, who used the alias Bowen. That's the gentleman who sat on the bus that went to Mexico, to Oaxaca, Mexico, where J. Edgar Hoover ran the team of assassins. This is all described in the Torba document. And Don Norton, one of Albert Osborne's associates, and Oswald Double, was affiliated with Carl McIntyre. And J. Edgar Hoover used to spend his summers in California at the horse races close to Clint Murchison. He was very strongly linked to him in not only things they had in common, such as horse races, but in the political far right that constituted assassinations and murders and the coup in Dallas. Now, part of the Christian Defense League was run by Robert Brown and Reverend Gale. Gale was recently arrested. He's one of those names I've been mentioning. Robert Brown was put into business after being a Marines in Southeast Asia and Vietnam by John Singlaub of the Iran-Contra affair. And Robert Brown works with Michael Ledeen of the Defense Department of the National Security Agency. Ledeen affected coups in Europe and works with extreme right-wing and was part of the disinformation group around the assassination attempt of John Paul II, and he also was a Grenada with the Grenada Papers with Robert Brown. And this milieu of Charles Willoughby and General Walker and Billy Hargis was close to Clint Murchison. Billy Hargis worked with Frank Sturgis, otherwise known as Frank Friorini. His name is in the Christic Institute affidavit. If you look up in the index on page 32 or 33, and persons involved in the Bay of Pigs operations that were in fact in Dealey Plaza and were instrumental in having a part of killing John Kennedy were part of the Clint Murchison group. Murchison was close to H.L. Hunt and Robert Morris, a very kingpin in the Reed Irvine Accuracy and Media Association, and Morris was part of Young Americans for Freedom with Charles Willoughby and Ronald Reagan. Clint Murchison was a key part of these operations that were a international combine for assassinations, and John Kennedy was just one of many who were killed, many before and many after, and I got to understand them all the more I studied Kennedy's assassination. Working with Clint Murchison, this group was Edgar Eugene Bradley, who also worked with Clay Shaw in New Orleans, and Ronald Reagan refused to extradite Edgar Eugene Bradley when Jim Garrison wanted him for his trial. And Bradley and Carl McIntyre and Albert Osborne, J. Edgar Hoover, all were part of Division 5 of the FBI. So Clint Murchison had a lot of contacts with the people organized around the murder of John Kennedy and worked with them, as I say, this Carl McIntyre. And he also, through Edgar Bradley, worked with Dennis Mower, M-O-W-E-R, a leader of the Southern California Minutemen, and Murchison helped arm the Minutemen. And Bradley said that they wanted him to kill John Kennedy in 1960 before he was elected. And Edgar Eugene Bradley stayed with a Mr. and Mrs. Adelot in Louisiana, and her husband was a Minuteman. He was a member of the American Nazi Party, and Edgar Eugene Bradley and Mower had discussed the plans to kill John Kennedy, and Murchison put up the money for the Minutemen and the Division 5. He was closely associated with Osborne and this whole milieu. Now, Mower's close friend was a man named Philip Earl Schreib, S-C-H-E-I-B, Scheib, not Schreib. He stockpiled weapons and arsenals in the California Minutemen, and he was Carl McIntyre's representative who worked with J. Edgar Hoover, Edgar Eugene Bradley, and Mr. Mower, and they were linked and suspected of having a role in killing John Kennedy. And Scheib's associate, his name was Keith Gilbert, it still is, and at one time he was in San Quentin for planning to bomb and kill Martin Luther King in California. And Keith Gilbert's co-worker and friend is Richard Butler, who worked on the U-2 program at Lockheed, along with Thane Caesar, who killed Robert Kennedy in 1968. Clint Murchison was a part of the Albert Osborne, Reverend Gale, Clay Shaw, Edgar Eugene Bradley, Minutemen milieu, so it would be very reasonable to believe that the conversations heard in his home the night before Kennedy was killed were with the go-ahead, and history has linked these very people to the street assassins, and Murchison was one of the uppers, like J. Edgar Hoover, William Casey, and Edward Lansdale, and Santos Trafficante. And these people were very, very important from the corporate level, from the graduates, from the very fancy schools, the degrees at MIT and so forth, giving the orders on down. And then the Minutemen and the Nazis, American Nazis and German Nazis, then teamed together through the intelligence community and through people like J. Edgar Hoover. Now, to continue accuracy in media for the remaining of the program, I want to update those of you who might not have heard last week or the week before. Actually, this is part 4 of Accuracy in Media. The chairman of that organization, and he also has Accuracy in Academia, is Reed Irvine, chairman of the board. And the reason I'm doing these broadcasts is that he wrote to President Dr. Tom Clement of Foothill College in Los Altos Hills, and he complained and sent him some transcripts and tapes of programs that Nip Tuck and David Emery were doing on KFJC, suggesting, as he said, that the government or people, conspiracies were involved in the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, or that cancer could be caused by our various institutions and organizations. And I took the board of directors and officers off of the stationery of Accuracy in Media and looked them up in Who's Who and also in other material I had on AIM. And last week I shared with you some of the facts about the organization. And I believe that accuracy in media goes back much earlier than first described. It allegedly was set up, the corporate papers in 1969 were about to be set up. Nation magazine had an article a good friend sent to me from World Watchers. It came out September 13th, 1986, titled The Rise and Decline of Accuracy in Media by Michael Massing and Alan Wolf. Now, I don't know Massing and I don't know Wolf, but this alone is disinformation put in a leftist organization. I call it leftist because the Nation is a little different than National Review, if you want a left or right. And these people have put an article, a long article, saying that accuracy in media is on the decline. And there's no reason to believe that AIM isn't as strong today or stronger than when it was formed. And I can analyze this whitewash with you at another time. One interesting part of the article is that it describes Reed Irvine and his son Donald, who's executive secretary of AIM, and board members, and it said the group got its start in 1951 as the Council Against Communist Aggression to provide information to congressional staff members, published the Washington Inquirer, a zealous right-wing weekly, sent out mass mailings, and so forth. Now, 1951 is getting a little bit closer to the truth, and as I cited last week, I broke down again that British American Canadian corporation that became the World Commerce Corporation, and this was the umbrella network for these various activities and corporate levels that would include later knocking college professors out of the campus and college radios that would have information contrary to the official line in this country that researchers would have access to. So while accuracy in media on the cover was set up in 1969, and particularly by Abraham Kalish, he worked U.S. Information Agency, which is CIA, from 1949 to 1958, and from 1958 he was with the United States Army's Defense Intelligence School, then he with Reed Irvine and Dean Acheson, and I did a little bit on Acheson last week. We're putting this organization together, and I think that the Radio Free America and the U.S. Information Agency, which is practically the same thing, they're sister groups, should at this time be examined more carefully, because even the secrecy for those organizations, when you talk of accuracy in media, came out in the paper just this week. The San Francisco Chronicle had an article, April the 10th, editors warned of threats to press freedom. And the article says, on the 200th anniversary of our Constitution, we should celebrate our freedom. And Michael Gartner, the head of an organization of newspaper editors, the American Society of Newspaper Editors, cited 17 laws barring the publication or broadcast of information in the United States, and warned of other restrictions being considered. He said in 1948, and that's just 3 years after the World Commerce Corporation was set up, by 1948, the Smith-Mundt Act forbid the rebroadcast or reprinting of Voice of America editorials in this country. Now, there's been that kind of censorship. We don't know what our agencies, we pay the taxes for the Radio Free America or the U.S. Information Agency, and I didn't realize that they cannot have information shared with us. What they tell other people overseas is not told in America, so we don't know how badly our agencies are lying. Now, last week I broke down some, just a few second biography, if you can do justice in that time, to board members of AIM, and I went over Dean Acheson, Carl Robert Benditson, Midge Decter, Shelby Cullum Davis, Ellen Garwood, Dr. Thomas Jukes, Abraham Kalish, Claire Luce, Henry Salvatore, William Simon, Henry Gurney Sagerman, Eugene Wigner, and Lewis William Walt. So there are other names on the board of directors that I want to share with you and go into that information. Now, Covert Action has an article, a long article, on accuracy in media. It came out several years ago, and I took a lot of my material from their issue, but I also looked up, as I say, in Who's Who and in other books and articles, material that was important for me. And Covert Action is a group that are in Washington, D.C. They will not touch anything about the Kennedy assassination. They don't very often talk about domestic affairs, although they did a thing on AIM. Philip Agee, the well-known former CIA agent, is closely affiliated with their operation. They won't touch Jonestown, but the interesting thing is that they will not touch Henry Kissinger, Fritz Kramer, or the Kennedy assassination. And I hardly know the people back there. I know their names or I spoke to them. They won't touch the Torbett document. That's Kennedy assassination. And I'm wondering why, or Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King, the American murders. I wonder why they won't touch those subjects. Now, they go at length about a few people, and they give biographies of some of the better-known board members of AIM. But interestingly enough, they listed in this issue that they printed the people affiliated with AIM, the original founders or board members. And the name that stuck in my mind was a name that they gave one sentence to, and this man could affect or has affected our history as much as any single person, and he's almost an unknown that slipped through their list without being defined. And this is very important to ask why these people are just passed over. The name is Dr. William Yandell Elliot. They describe him as, this is how they describe him, as part of the AIM operation, original board or former board member. Dr. William Yandell Elliot, one-time Harvard University government professor who was on the National Security Council's planning board and was a trustee of Radio Liberty, long sponsored by the CIA. He was on the National Security Council's planning board. We had no National Security Council when World War II was over in 1945. By 1947, we had a national security, and this was the back door of the White House, the planning stage that became operational as soon as Richard Nixon was elected and Henry Kissinger could open those doors and do secret operations without Congress knowing, ignoring Congress. Now, Dr. William Yandell Elliot is the mentor of Henry Kissinger and of Alexander Haig's family and Kissinger family at Harvard, and I looked up his name just in 2 books on Henry Kissinger. He's in almost every book on Henry Kissinger. There's one called The Kissinger, The Uses of Power by David Landau, and it describes Henry Kissinger in this way and his relationship to this Yandell Elliot, who's affiliated with Accuracy in Media. It said, the most dangerous flaw of Henry Kissinger is believing that domestic opinion should never be an obstacle to the conduct of foreign policy. If you feel that the internal relations should be conducted on non-ideological grounds, he then assumes that the internal policy should not extend to foreign ventures, that he should be able, whoever's in charge, should be able to do whatever they want to do. And keep in mind that Kissinger and Haig are proteges of Fritz Kramer and this character from Harvard, who was more than a Harvard professor, as you see. This William Yandell Elliot helped form the National Security Council and was from Radio Free Liberty, which is CIA. The book on the Uses of Power by David Landau talks about Henry Kissinger's ideas about global influence and his anti-Soviet policy and how the United States allies should all get together with regimes not on the basis of domestic structure, but on the basis of their hostility towards the Soviet Union. In many areas of the Third World, there would be no viable alternative between regimes headed by right-wing strongmen on the one hand and a popular front government. We must support the military power, and it reduces itself to military power alone. Even in Europe, the cradle of civilization, Washington bolstered a number of right-wing regimes to maintain NATO unity. In Greece, we put in the military junta, the former Nazis, in Portugal and in Spain with Franco, of course, and the underlying rationale of bolstering right-wing regimes is that the decision makers believe that American domestic opinion isn't of consequence, that Washington's behavior abroad should serve not day-to-day needs of the popular sovereignty, but a grander vision of nation-state diplomacy. Well, at Harvard, when Henry Kissinger was at Harvard, upon his arrival in 1946, the year after the war was over, he went right into the laps of the Harvard policy intellectuals and his fame and fortune began when he was tied to William Yandell Elliot, a small-town boy from Tennessee, turned brilliant scholar, All-American tackle at Vanderbilt, who became the ruling power in Harvard's Department of Government. He studied at Oxford, as did Reed Irvine, then came back to the United States and prepared young disciples and senior scholars in his way of thinking. Even by the standards of the late 40s, he was a violent, cold warrior, one who would not tolerate the slightest deviation from the path of unrelenting struggle against the Stalinist terror. And that was Elliot. They described him in the late 40s as something as a King Lear figure stalking a rainy, windy moor. This is Kissinger, The Uses of Power. Wild Bill Elliot had gone to war with the rest of the country in the 40s. He got prominence in the Office of War Mobilization. He was intoxicated with power, and the lust of power and the purpose of power he transmitted to Henry Kissinger. Well, it was John J. McCloy, the attorney for the Rockefeller interests for Chase Manhattan for Agee Farben, along with Fritz Kramer from Germany, who was then in the Defense Department or getting out of the Dachau prison to go into the Defense Department, that put Kissinger in the laps of Mr. Elliot. They had a chain of command, and Kissinger Associates becomes the roving State Department, or as Representative Henry Gonzalez said, the hired gun. The State Department rented out to Kissinger Associates. Elliot made use of Kissinger's talents as a scholar's assistant. With Elliot, Kissinger founded and directed the International Seminar, under which several dozen bright and influential foreigners spent the summer months at Harvard. And thanks to Elliot, Kissinger founded and edited a scholarly journal called Confluence, and he managed a magazine called Foreign Affairs. Then Kissinger went on to the Council of Foreign Relations, where he became the chief expert on the subject of nuclear weapons. Under the tutelage of Elliot, he worked with George Bundy, who was National Security Advisor under the late John Kennedy, who was murdered, and he was a close friend of Henry Kissinger's. And Elliot was a big influence, and he turns out to be one of the founders of the National Security Council and also an active participant with Reed Irvine in Accuracy in Media. Another book which would not be favorable to Henry Kissinger. She was trying to criticize him, but of course, whether you like him or dislike him, the story always comes out the same. Phyllis Schlafly and an Admiral, Chester Ward, wrote a book called Kissinger on the Couch. And she describes in this book Kissinger's relationship with the elitist groups to understand his motivation, how he got on the Council of Foreign Relations, and how Kissinger wrote an early book in 1961 called The Necessity for Choice. Now, Robert Mayu of the FBI and CIA had already linked up with Santos Trafficante, setting up death squads as of the summer of 1960, and Henry Kissinger becomes an expert in his book, The Necessity for Choice. You don't have much choice when a bullet blows your brain off, and John Kennedy said there was this hidden government behind his back and fingered Allen Dulles. And, of course, Kissinger and Elliot and these people worked closely with Allen Dulles and John J. McCloy and, of course, William Donovan of the OSS. The Schlafly book says that more than any other man living today, Kissinger is a creation of the Council of Foreign Relations. He owes his associations in the ruling clique to two people. First, after high school, when he went in the U.S. Army as a private, and by 1943, he had met with his benefactor who changed his life, Private, later Colonel Fritz Kramer, who in 1943 was lecturing to Army audiences on the U.S. objectives in the war against the Nazis. Private Kramer was a German from a distinguished family whose wife and son Sven were living in Nazi Germany during the war, as I said before many times. And he worked closely with Henry Kissinger, picked him up, and Kissinger acquired an interest in philosophy, political theory, international relations, and as the war progressed, Dr. Fritz Kramer attained promotions for his abilities, and in turn he brought his protege to the attention of the superiors, and Kissinger became translator for the commanding general and later administrator of an occupied German district. This was in Oberammergau with the likes of Klaus Barbie. So Phyllis Schlafly and the Navy officer are saying this was one of his mentors. Kramer became a civilian advisor to the Secretary of the Army on military and political strategy. He is still there when they wrote this book. He survived McNamara's 7-year dictatorship in the Pentagon, which of course they worked with, and she's saying that was a mystery how he survived. but out of Harvard and having the same people in common and mentors, Kramer and Kissinger and McNamara proceeded then to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam to decimate Southeast Asia. She writes, his son Sven Kramer survived more than 5 years on Kissinger's staff. Sven had written his honors thesis at Harvard under Kissinger's auspices, and he worked with Elliot. He went to work for the pre-Kissinger National Security Council during the Johnson administration, and he's still there now. It's either Fritz Kramer or Sven Kramer. According to Evans and Novak, they can't have it both ways, or it's both, but they're still running the National Security Council. And then the other mentor that they describe in Kissinger's undergraduate work at Harvard, he came up and signed up with a distinguished anti-communist, Dr. William Yandell Elliot. The combination of such a mentor with Kissinger's intellect resulted in graduation summa cum laude in 1950. He got his master's degree in 1952, his doctorate in 1954. Professor Elliot was the last anti-communist who influenced Henry Kissinger's life or career, except for Dr. Edward Teller. Now, Teller's on the board of Accuracy in Media. Teller's on the board of Western Goals, the father of the hydrogen bomb. Of course, Phyllis Schlafly thinks that these are the last two anti-communists. Henry Kissinger has been nothing but a rabid anti-communist, putting fascists into governments, overthrowing democracies, whether it's Iran or Chile or South Korea or Vietnam or Bolivia or the United States. He's been part of the team with the global strategy. It doesn't matter who's there if it's not a communist. And in this book, she mentions those mentors of his, Elliot and Kramer, who had the big influence on his life. They also write in their book, the Council of Foreign Relations gave him the title of having the most prestige as Director of Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy Studies for the Council of Foreign Relations. And the book that he wrote, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, in 1957, brought Henry Kissinger fame, fortune, influence, and prestige, and ultimately entree into the White House, where he was National Security Advisor, where he began to run those secret operations that literally took over the government and ignored the Congress, the Defense Department, the CIA. The seeds of Contragate were set up by Fritz Kramer and Mr. Elliot. And the interesting thing is that I didn't know where this professor from Harvard was coming from, but sure enough, he helped form the National Security Council, and then he had the body or the framework to put his agents like Henry Kissinger or Elmer Poindexter or Robert McFarlane and so forth. Now, to a few more people on the board of Accuracy in Media before the time runs out, I would like to just mention a few of them. One is a man named Murray Barron. He's described as a past and present officer. He was among the past who had served, and he's still very active with Accuracy in Media. He's been with them since 1972. That was just before the Watergate came tumbling down, because as soon as Richard Nixon was in power, by 1969, the government began to change face, and a lot of these people got their real far right-wing muscle because the COINTEL program and the operations that were planned were to turn this country into a literal fascist state with burglaries, mail openings, and surveillance, and mind control, drug operations on people. The powers that be were going bananas once they finally got the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and Malcolm X tucked away. They could do whatever they want. Murray Barron joined AIM in 1972, and he has been the president since 1976. He first made his living in 1930 in the Teamsters Union in New Jersey in labor and industrial relations. He was a trustee of Freedom House, a right-wing counterpart to Amnesty International, a member of the CIA organization Citizens Committee for a Free Cuba. Now, Citizens Committee for a Free Cuba was operated out of Mullen Associates, that's E. Howard Hunt, and the Watergators in Washington. One of their clients was Riley Coffee Company, where Lee Harvey Oswald was employed. And the president of AIM, Murray Barron, was part of the CIA-sponsored Citizens Committee for Peace and Freedom in Vietnam. And in exchange for many introductions he has made to Accuracy in Media, he introduces right-wing and corporate support. He gets a finder's fee of $1,000 a month. A lot of these biographies I'm getting from the Covert Action. I haven't even looked them up in Who's Who yet, but you can get a little smack of who they are, and then I can do more on them. Another board member is Elbridge Dubrow, who joined the State Department in 1930, held diplomatic posts in Poland, Romania, Soviet Union, Italy, Portugal, Malaysia, was ambassador to Vietnam from 1957 to 61. Diem was murdered in 63, October of 63. Before retiring in 1968, he left the diplomatic field to serve as an advisor to the commander of Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Richard Secord was down there for a while after West Point. In 1971, he was director of Freedom Studies Center, set up by the far-right American Security Council. He still has a hand in AIM affairs, even though he now is 81 years old. This whole accuracy in media is a Defense Department CIA operation set up with the corporate level, and it is a disservice for authors in Nation magazine to say it declined, because for all we know, they may have stopped professors from all over this country from holding on to their tenure or their jobs. And how do we know that Accuracy Media wasn't in charge of, say, WBAI or Pacifica Radio? They called Bob up and took Bob Fass and Mae Brussell's programs off the air, and there was no way that not anything like that could be heard on BAI again. And that in Manhattan, there are a lot of people who hear that station, and also in Berkeley with KPFA or LA KPFK. Pacifica is a foundation, and those foundations can be touched by people writing letters that you don't always see how they write or what they say. But the head of these radio stations makes sure that except for a guest appearance, there is no way you can get back on those programs. Well, I wanted to do about 20 more people involved with AIM, but our time is up. I see that. I can't continue. So I'll have to do part 5 maybe next week. It's very, very important. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. Thank you for keeping track with the books, records, and keep reading the papers and following this very interesting news.